I'm Nick Burns. This is Michael Dobbs. Michael was, let's talk about was first and is second, was an outstanding foreign correspondent, diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post over many, many years. We met when I was State Department spokesperson, as we say now, and Michael was covering the State Department. We traveled extensively together to many parts of the world. Michael did outstanding reporting from Eastern Europe, from the former Soviet Union, and the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. Covered several secretaries of state and had a very long, distinguished career in journalism. And to prove it, there is a second act in American life. He has now become a celebrated author, and he's written about particular subjects. He's written 3 books, all of them one as interesting as the other. The first is Down with Big Brother, at the end of communism. The second, 1 Minute to Midnight, a new look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I told my class today, Michael, that the key foundational work on the Cuban Missile Crisis was Graham Ellison's work, Essence of Decision, 1971, I think, wasn't it? And Michael's book, I think, is in that pantheon. Very well received. Lots of publicity about this harrowing tale of the near miss of October 1962. And now he's written a new book called 6 Months in 1945 about the beginning of the Cold War. Yalta, the beginning of the Cold War. A lot of historians would have made it put it in 46 or 47, some maybe even 48. Michael puts it at Yalta, February, March of 1945. So Michael and I thought, he spoke at the Davis Center today about that subject. We thought that Michael might talk to us about what lessons do we take from the Cold War. And Michael, just one more thing. Some of the students here are from the course I teach on great powers. Mm-hmm. And we're looking at great power cooperation, competition, collision, conflict in the next 20 years. The new great powers, China, India, Brazil, with the old powers, Russia, EU, the United States. So we hope that a lot of what you'll have to say will have some translation for what we're trying to do looking at the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So please join me in welcoming Michael Dobbs.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. You can all hear me without any problem, right? I think the Cold War, it's sort of gone out of fashion a little bit, but I was brought up as a Cold War kid, and there's proof of that. This is a photograph of my mother, my brother, and myself. I think it's 1956, when Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union. We're in the British Embassy in Moscow, the courtyard of the British Embassy, on the other side of the Moscow River to the Kremlin. So I actually went to Moscow at the age of 6 weeks, I think. I was actually born in Britain, but my parents were diplomats at the British Embassy in Moscow, and they took me out to Moscow at that age. So I kind of imbibed this from a very young age, and I like to boast that I have lived in the Soviet Union under every Soviet leader from Stalin onwards. Since I was born in 1950, and I think my parents took me out later in 1950, so Stalin was still in power then. And then I came back in different guises, first as a diplomatic brat, and then as a journalist, and more recently as a historian. So I've looked at it in different ways, as perhaps this is nostalgia, but I think the Cold War there's a good argument to be made that it was the most successful war, at least in modern American history, that the United States has ever fought. And there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from it. It's sort of rather out of fashion now, but I think we need to look at how we fought the Cold War and why we won it. And I think the basic reason for the success, I will go into this later, is that the United States fought the Cold War on the way it fought the Cold War played to America's strengths rather than to America's weaknesses. And I think the way we've approached the war on terror, as it's called, has in many cases played to America's weaknesses rather than its strengths. So we were forced to fight the Cold War in a way that actually gave us an advantage. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. The photograph at the bottom here, just to show you
I didn't realize you were there.
This is sort of me, Zelik-like, in front of Boris Yeltsin when he climbed on the tank in August 1991, I guess.
91.
Which was the sort of symbolic moment in the collapse of communism, along with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I just happened to be standing outside the White House, the Russian Parliament building, when Yeltsin strode out. And for a moment, I thought of actually climbing up on the tank. But, and it would have been a great photo opportunity for me. It would have looked wonderful on the cover of my books, but on the flap jacket. But my sort of journalistic objectivity got the better of me. Otherwise, I would be one of those guys standing next to Yeltsin actually on the tank, rather than with a tape recorder. You can see I have a tape recorder in my hand at the bottom of the tank. So I was in the Soviet Union as the bureau chief of the Washington Post between 1988 and 93, which was an extraordinary time, when we witnessed the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. So basically, if you've done that as a journalist, your career is downhill from there. There's nothing you can do that will ever quite match witnessing the end of an empire. And when I got back from Moscow in 93, I wanted to write about what I'd seen in a more in-depth way than I'd been able to do as a reporter, and that was the motivation for this book, the first book I wrote, on the right, Down with Big Brother. You know, they often say that journalists write the first rough draft of history, and I wanted to write the second rough draft of history by, you know, re-interviewing people, tapping into archives, which were then spilling out into the open. And as a result, I found out a lot of things that I hadn't known as a reporter, and it gave me a new understanding of what had happened during those years. So I wrote the first book, and I said I'd never write another book, but I ended up writing other books, and the second one I wrote about the Cold War was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, having written about the end of the Cold War, I wanted to write about the peak of the Cold War, and that was really the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. So having done that, I said, well, I'll never write another book again, but I ended up wondering about how the Cold War started. And that resulted in this latest book, 6 Months in 1945. And with each book, I guess I've sort of become less of an eyewitness and more of a historian, because when you're writing about events in 45, you're completely dependent on archival records. There are few people to go and left to interview. I think I have, you know, an understanding of the sweep of the Cold War from the beginning to the end. 6 Months in 1945 is meant to be a provocative title, because as Nick said, a lot of people think the Cold War began later. I trace it back to this 6-month period between the Yalta Conference in February of 45 and the dawning of the atomic age with the bombing of Hiroshima in August of 1945. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning of the Cold War. This is the famous photograph of the big three at Yalta on the top left, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And they met at the beginning of February 45. Yeltsin. FDR was dying at the time. He had only a few months to live. He'd just been inaugurated for the 4th time. But he wanted to make one final mission, which was to, as he put it, secure the peace. He had seen what happened after the First World War when the League of Nations collapsed, and he had 2 goals in going to Yalta. Halfway across the world, a trip that practically killed him. One was to bring the Russians into the war against Japan, which he calculated would save 100,000, 200,000 American lives. And his second goal was to lay the structure for the post-war era through the United Nations. Now, this map that you see on the right is a map of the World War II, the Eastern Front, on February 4th, 1945, on the day the Yalta Conference opened. And you see that the Soviet army has swept through Poland. It's already occupied East Prussia, is into German territory proper. They've crossed Zhukov's forces have crossed the Oder at several points. They're actually 39 miles from Berlin on the day the Yalta Conference opens. Now this, we tend to think there's such a propaganda in this country about how the Americans, with a little help from the British, won the Second World War. We barely hear about the Russians at all. But this was the reality on the ground when the Yalta Conference opened. And subsequently there was a big debate about who lost Eastern Europe. Did FDR give away Eastern Europe at Stalin? And this map, I think, demonstrates that Eastern Europe was not FDR's to give away. Stalin was in possession in the same way that Alexander II was in possession of Poland in the 19th century, and he wasn't going to give it up to anyone. So this was the hand that FDR was dealt with at Yalta. So, whatever FDR did and however he handled it, you'd have still ended up with Stalin's forces in occupation of Poland and most of Eastern Europe. Now, I've called this a Faustian bargain because, underlying the Russian-American relationship in the war was the idea, whether it was stated explicitly or not, and sometimes it was stated explicitly, that more dead Russians meant less dead Americans. There's you had to kill a certain number of Germans in order to win the war. And the more Germans the Russians killed, in other words, the more Germans and the more Russians who were killed on the Eastern Front, the less Americans and British would die on the Western Front. It's a kind of mathematical equation. 3.5 million Germans were killed on the Eastern Front, compared to 1 million on the Western Fronts, all Western Fronts combined. So in other words, the Russians killed 3 times as many Germans as we did. In Churchill's phrase, they tore the guts, the Soviet army tore the guts out of the Wehrmacht, the German army. 8 million Soviet soldiers were killed during the war. It's not counting civilian deaths, just military deaths, compared to 416,000 Americans and 383,000 British, i.e. about 800,000 together. So, in other words, Soviet sacrifices were 10 times the British and American sacrifices combined. And there was a price to be paid for this, or that Stalin thought there was, and he was in a position to exact the price. And the price was Soviet control in one form or another of Eastern Europe. He was prepared to tolerate sacrifice. He didn't think about, losing millions of men in the same way that a Western politician would think about that. But he was, a very realistic politician and a pragmatic politician. And he understood both in Europe and the Far East that he was going to exact a territorial price for his participation in both wars. Now, actually, at the bottom of this, just to show how sort of little Americans know about this, even educated Americans, about the war, because we're kind of fed this propaganda of, the Greatest Generation and D-Day and so on, and forgetting about the Eastern Front. At the bottom of this is Auschwitz, which was liberated by Soviet troops during this period in February of '45. And if you recall the last election, but Obama, Harvard-educated Obama, was going around saying that his grandfather liberated Auschwitz. I was the Washington Post fact-checker at the time. I used to hand out what we call Pinocchios to lying politicians, and I gave Obama 4 Pinocchios for saying that his grandfather helped to liberate Auschwitz. And his people were sort of very cross with me. They said, well, that's not a 4 Pinocchio lie. That's perhaps a 1 or 2 Pinocchio lie. But in fact, his grandfather had taken part in the liberation of Buchenwald, which is on the other side of Germany. But I felt it was a 4 Pinocchio because, it revealed, I don't think it was intentional, but it revealed a kind of total lack of knowledge of European geography and history, and a total undervaluation of what the Soviets had done during the war. And if, the President of the United States, or the man who shortly became President of the United States, had that kind of understanding of who did what during the war, you can imagine what ordinary Americans had. So there was this sort of Faustian bargain. The fact is that the Russians did most of the killing of Germans in the Second World War. Now, I think that there were two different armies met in the heart of Europe. My argument in this book is that the Cold War became inevitable when these two different armies, two different nations, met in the heart of Europe in the last few weeks of the Second World War. And, this kind of a couple of shots that illustrate this confrontation, or this clash of different armies, different ideologies, different economic systems, and so on and so forth. The top is actually when the Americans are on the road to Berlin they're given a zone to occupy, and there's an American tank meeting a Soviet army supply train. The Soviets were still relying on horse-driven carts for their supplies. They were an army that lived off the land. The Americans had a huge logistics operation. The Russians, when they arrived in a place, they wanted to feed their troops. They would just confiscate it from the local population. And the other photograph is actually taken of Soviet and American airmen at a base in Poltava, Ukraine, which was an experiment in US-Soviet military cooperation, which fell apart very quickly. The Soviets, and this is one of the early photographs to show how successful it was, but soon these, the Allied forces started becoming rivals and even enemies. But this photograph sort of shows, I guess Joe Nye teaches here, right? So this is American soft power versus Soviet hard power. And my argument is actually that soft power ended up winning the Cold War. This photograph on the top left is of the meeting of Soviet and American troops on the Elbe in April of 45. I think it's April the 24th, the same day as the United Nations founding conference took place in San Francisco. There's another photograph of that Poltava airbase at a time when the two sides were cooperating. But very quickly after, there was a pattern. Wherever Americans and Russians met along the, having defeated their common enemy, the Germans, they would be a few days of sort of backslapping, celebration, drinking vodka, and so on and so forth, you see here. And then, as soon as they got to know each other, that sort of superficial friendship would turn very quickly, a few days later, into distrust and eventually into enmity. And you can see this from the letters they wrote home at the time. There are different, as I said, there are different types of army with different ways of doing things, from simple things like they arrive in a German village and the Americans would billet themselves in a German house, and they would sleep in the beds and have a good night's sleep and then leave the house, and the Germans would return. In the Russian case, they arrived in a house, they didn't sleep in the beds, they threw the beds out into the street, and trophy teams would come by, and all the other furniture, and cart the furniture back to Russia. So you had these two armies with sort of totally different kind of moral outlooks on life. meeting each other and attempting to run Germany together. I think that the Cold War actually begins at this point, when Russians and Americans meet in the heart of Europe. And I think it was predicted by de Tocqueville in 1835, more than a century before. This is what de Tocqueville talks about when he's writing about these two rising powers, Russia and America, which he already sees when he comes to America in the early 18th century. He writes that America symbolizes the forces of freedom, and Russia, of course it was long before the communist period, it was under the Tsars, but it was still an autocracy, represents the servitude. And their starting point is different, de Tocqueville wrote, and their courses are not the same, yet each of them, Russia and America, seems marked out by the will of heaven to sway the destinies of half the globe. And I think that prediction actually comes true in 1945 when these two emerging superpowers meet in the heart of Europe. I seem to have missed out. And I think it's most evident, actually, not from the point of view of the leaders. It's most evident, you see it most clearly at the bottom rather than the top. The leaders, even including Stalin, at these conferences, are still trying to find a way of getting on together. They don't want an immediate Cold War, but forces on the ground are kind of driving them inexorably in the direction of a confrontation. And finally, it's the invention of the atomic bomb, the first atomic test, the bombing of Hiroshima, which, if there was any chance of avoiding a Cold War, I think it's settled by August of 1945. The photograph on the right is of Americans discovering a Russian nuclear reactor, atomic reactor, as soon as they entered Germany, because they knew, both sides knew that the Germans had a crude nuclear atomic program. They immediately started looking for uranium, other atomic materials, trying to round up the scientists, and of course they didn't share that information with the other side. We did it, and the Russians were doing the same thing. So the idea that these two sides were cooperating with each other between February and April of 1945 is completely false, and you see it very clearly in their race to acquire, expertise, bomb-making materials as soon as they arrive in Germany. And it's in fact at Potsdam that Truman tells Stalin, although Stalin probably already knows because he has spies in Los Alamos, that the Americans have come across a weapon of enormous power. He didn't use the phrase an atomic bomb, but Stalin understood him immediately. And Stalin's response was to pick up the telephone to the head of the Soviet bomb program and order an acceleration of the Soviet bomb program. So actually the atomic race is the defining feature of the Cold War. Now, the effect of the invention of atomic weapons, America got the bomb in July of 45, and the Soviet Union followed suit in 1948, 3 years later. It meant it had one obvious consequence. What do you think it was? The two sides had the atomic bomb. What do you think that resulted in? How did that change our outlook on war?
You started to have a policy of deterrence.
Yeah, a policy of deterrence. But what did it mean? Could we go to war at that point? Could we settle our differences through military conflict? Or
not directly.
Not directly, no. So it kind of froze the possibility of war, at least on this central front. Of course, there were proxy wars fought all over the place, but it defined the course of the Cold War. Actually, George Orwell writes about this. The phrase Cold War comes from George Orwell in essay that he wrote in October 1945. He says the invention of atomic weapons is going to lead to what he calls an epoch as horribly stale as the slave empires of antiquity. He said it would be like a peace that is no peace, characterized by a permanent state of Cold War. And that's the first reference I've been able to find of this phrase, Cold War, and it's indicative that it was in this period, that it was, and in this context. In other words, it froze everything in place. Now, I think from the American point of view, that was actually a great advantage because the Soviets had a conventional superiority in Europe at the time. And it meant for us that we had to fight this war, the Cold War, by other means. We couldn't fight it by open military conflict where we were at a disadvantage. So Clausewitz says, war is an extension of politics by other means. I think you can rephrase that to say that the Cold War was an extension of war by other means. It was still a war, but you couldn't have the direct military confrontation between two people with two superstates with nuclear weapons was ruled out. And that was actually ended up being beneficial to from the American point of view. Now, actually, there's still people on the American side who thought it was a good idea to fight a war as long as we had some superiority, which we did up until the 60s.
A nuclear war, you're talking about.
A nuclear war, yeah. There were still people who made that argument, and one of the foremost of them was General Curtis LeMay, the head of the Strategic SAC, Strategic Air Command.
Yeah.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis, LeMay essentially saw that as an opportunity to finish off the commie bastards once and for all. And he made that argument. Fortunately, Kennedy didn't buy it. But you can see why, from this graph, what the nuclear disparity was at that time in 1962. The Soviets were beginning to build up their nuclear arsenals, but they were still vastly inferior to the Americans. Now, actually, the 1960 election, you may know, had been fought on the basis of a missile gap. Kennedy was saying that the Soviets were ahead. In fact, it was the other way around. The Americans were ahead. And this illustrates that. This is the missile gap in 1962, vastly to the advantage of the United States. In ICBMs, 182 to 42, a huge, the most dramatic advantage was actually in Curtis LeMay's bomber force. And the 270 Soviet bombers would probably have never gotten through. I've also included in that breakdown the intermediate range and medium range missiles based in Turkey, Italy, Cuba that have sort of defined strategic weapons as ones that can reach the territory of the other part. So in Cuba, with Cuba, that was the whole point of the missile crisis, that Khrushchev stationed medium-range missiles in Cuba which could reach the territory of the United States. But it didn't actually vastly change things, I put 8 to 32 because by the end of the famous 13 days, they had 8 missiles that were ready to fire the United States out of 32. But that didn't actually change the nuclear balance all that much. It didn't give the Soviets a first strike capability. And the United States still had a huge advantage, still had an advantage about 10 to 1, which gave it second strike capability, that even if the Soviets used all their weapons, that we could still wipe out the whole of the Soviet Union. That's why Curtis LeMay thought this is the best chance we have of finishing the job. But fortunately, now, I've included this graph to show you what happens. So in 1962, there's still a big advantage in favor of the United States. But what happens after the missile crisis? The Soviets, partly in response to the humiliation, as they perceive it, of having to withdraw their missiles from Cuba, begin a huge build-up of their missile strength, which accelerates in the 70s under Brezhnev until they overtake the United States, at least in terms of the number of missiles. So it's the last time, the Cuban Missile Crisis was actually the last time when the United States enjoyed a significant advantage and could even think about this. After the missile crisis, it became impossible. It froze the battlefront. Now, fortunately, Kennedy and Khrushchev, they didn't take the advice of people like Curtis LeMay. And I think one reason they didn't was their experiences of the Second World War. That Kennedy had been, as you all know, a commander of a PT boat in the Pacific, had seen war up close, and as had Khrushchev. And that's quote is from a letter that Kennedy wrote to his Swedish girlfriend during the Second World War. I mean, he goes on in much more graphic terms about how futile the war is. But that stayed with him, and he understood when the question came of possible nuclear confrontation that a nuclear war was going to be vastly different to any type of war they'd seen before. And Khrushchev had the same idea. In fact, this is a letter that he writes to Kennedy during the missile crisis, at the peak of the missile crisis. War ends when it has rolled through cities and villages everywhere, sowing death and destruction. Khrushchev was doing a lot of saber rattling, but he had no intention of going to war at all because he'd seen it. And there's a bit of a digression, but we talk about, the value of military experience for leaders. I think this illustrates it, that Kennedy had in his bones a kind of a fear of what might... He understood the meaning of war. I think more recent presidents, I won't mention them, have not had that same kind of instinctive understanding. Now, just another digression on one of the things that has interested me in writing these three books has been the role of the individual in history. Do individuals determine history, as Carlyle, I think, wrote in the 19th century, or is history sort of propelled by larger forces over which individuals have little control, the kind of Tolstoyan view of history? And I think if you look at the Cold War, you see at different times, individuals have played a different type of role. In the missile crisis, one of the dramas of the missile crisis is that Kennedy and Khrushchev brought the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation through their mistakes, but then they had the wisdom to bring it back. And with other leaders, you could have imagined a very different result. So I think personality played a big part in the missile crisis. With the beginning of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, I'm not so sure. I think, it was much more the sort of large forces of history. I don't think that, some people claim that Reagan destroyed the Soviet Union. I think all this is nonsense. I don't even think that Gorbachev did. The reason for the final collapse of the Soviet Union was, I think, identified by George Kennan back in the 40s. And this quote sort of summarizes it. And this quote is kind of the basis for the principle of containment with which we associate Kennan's name. That the United States has it in its power to increase enormously the strains under which Soviet policy must operate, and in this way promote tendencies which must eventually find their outlet in either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. For no mystical messianic movement, and particularly not that of the Kremlin, can face frustration indefinitely without eventually adjusting itself in one way or another to the logic of that state of affairs. I mean, Kennan understood when he was sort of sitting in the Moscow embassy in 1945, and he was already writing this in 1945, long before he wrote this article, that there were inherent contradictions in the Soviet system which were fated sooner or later to bring the system crashing down. And we see the fulfillment of this prediction in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, I'm not saying the Cold War had to end the way it did, or the Soviet Union had to end the way it did. I think the Soviet Union was doomed. It could have come about in a different kind of way. But I think I happen to think that it was inevitable. Why was it inevitable? Because first and foremost, the nature of the Soviet state and the nature of the Soviet economy, which was based heavily on the exploitation of natural resources. It was an extensive economy, taking as much as you could out of nature, and which meant that they didn't have to kind of grapple with the kind of problems that capitalist Western countries faced, which was how to raise productivity. And this graph shows you, one graph is Soviet oil production, and the other line is Soviet oil production, the other is the price of oil. So in the 70s, they got a huge boost on both fronts. The price of oil started spiraling upwards, and Soviet oil production started going upwards as well. And this gave this is during the Brezhnev period, the period that Russians call the era of stagnation. It actually subsidized the entire Soviet economy and the economy of their empire throughout the 70s. And reality didn't really begin to intrude until the 80s. Now you see what happens in the 80s. The red line, the price of oil, suddenly plummets at the beginning of 1980 to 1985, when Gorbachev is appointed the General Secretary, the Soviet leader. I think this graph explains Gorbachev's emergence as the Soviet leader, determined to shake things up, understanding, and the rest of the Soviet leadership understanding, that they had to make a huge change in their in their economy in order to compete with the other side. Actually, oil production was still holding up at the beginning of the Gorbachev period, but then it goes into precipitous decline, 1991. So after 1991, you have both lines going down. They suddenly discovered that they could no longer subsidize the empire in the way they had been subsidizing the empire. And this created the basis for the grand bargain that resulted in the collapse of communism. Communism collapsed, well, first in Eastern Europe and then in the inner empire, the Soviet Union. And I think one reason it collapsed peacefully was that the Soviets themselves understood, and the Soviet elite understood, that it was in their own interest to let these colonies, if you want to call them that, go. When I was in Poland, the Poles thought that they were subsidizing the Russians. That was completely untrue. The subsidies were the other way. The Russians were subsidizing the Poles, Ukrainians, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and they were getting fed up with it by the late 80s, early 90s. They understood that everybody else was leeching on them, and in the meantime, their own standard of living in Russia was, declining. That they lived worse than all these other people who were receiving subsidized Soviet oil. So that was the nature of the grand bargain, actually, that led to first of all the abandonment of the outer empire, and then the disintegration of the Soviet Union. That the understanding was that the Russians would charge world prices for their oil and control their natural resources, but the price they paid for that was to let the subject nations go. At the same time, this was, one of Gorbachev's weapons to get things moving was glasnost, openness. And I was there during the Congress of People's Deputies in 1989, the first semi-free elected parliament in Soviet history, and one of the rare occasions in Russian history. We'd all been reading the Marquis de Custine, who was a kind of de Tocqueville who went to Russia instead of to America. But this is something that the Marquis de Custine wrote in 1839. Nations are mute only for a time. Sooner or later, the day of discussion arises. As soon as speech is restored to this silenced people, one will hear so much dispute that an astonished world, I think it is, will think it has returned to the confusion of Babel. And that really kind of summarizes this sort of chaotic scenes at the first Russian parliament there, with Gorbachev sort of subjecting himself to the media. And we really witnessed, one of the things we witnessed at this point was what I call the demystification of Soviet power, that there'd been this sort of Politburo with their portraits up in Red Square, and suddenly we were getting close to them, and seeing that they were mortal human beings. And journalists actually contributed to that process. So this is the Soviet supermarket in Moscow, and it's a sort of typical scene from an American supermarket. The Russians understood, as I said, that they were living worse than anybody else, and they wanted to live better. And Boris Yeltsin, in his autobiography, describes a kind of moment of when he understood this. He came to America in 1989, and of course he was taken around a whole lot of the sites, and he wasn't impressed with any of them. What really impressed him was he was taken to see an American supermarket in Houston. And he came, one of his aides writes about this experience, how they sort of went from the vegetable section to the cheese section, and there were all these different colored cheeses, and at the end of it, their impressions, their senses were so stunned at the end of this that Yeltsin turned to his aide and said, "Now I realize why they had to fool the people." And Yeltsin actually came back to Russia, and that was part of his sort of accelerated campaign to present himself as a Democrat. But that's just one person's conversion. But Russians in general, the entire Russian population was going through this same process of ideological conversion at the end of the 80s, understanding that communism simply hadn't delivered for them, that the shelves were empty. And I included this because it's a sort of dramatic illustration. This was a society that had to lock up their toilet rolls when there were toilet rolls. Often there weren't. They didn't just lock up their toilet rolls, they locked up Xerox machines. When I was a reporter in Moscow, you couldn't go, there were no Xerox machines. In order to get all the Xerox machines, even at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, were kept under lock and key. And you had to, here you're so able to reproduce everything whenever you want. A Soviet researcher, had to get permission to visit the room with the Xerox machine in it. But despite these attempts at control, we're talking about this information technological revolution, this was happening in a cruder way in Russia and Eastern Europe during the 70s and 80s in particular. First of all, samizdat, the typewriter, samizdat, which means, self-publication, and just, typing out 6 copies on this is an Erica typewriter, the East German typewriter. And then what was called magnetizdat, which means tape publishing, that people would, the bards would sing songs on tape, which would then passed from one person to another. The scene on the right is from the Lenin shipyard in August of 1980, which I was present at these scenes where people are, because the regime controls all the media.
In Poland.
In Poland, yeah.
Gdansk.
Well, in any communist country, but this is in Gdansk, Poland. And they've sort of found a way around this by holding up what were then these cassette tape recorders. That was the most advanced technology of the time, and going back to their factories with the cassettes and distributing them all around Poland. And then, of course, the sort of just leaflets. But I put this in to show you that this, we talk a lot about this, the Twitter revolution and the internet revolution and so on and so forth. I mean, there have been communication revolutions all the time. And the communication revolution, even though the internet hadn't been invented, was certainly one of the factors in the collapse of communism. So these 2 photographs, I think, kind of illustrate the sort of course of the Cold War between 1945 and 1989. The photograph on the left is just after this meeting on the Elbe between Russian soldiers and American soldiers. And the German civilians are all fleeing away, running away with as much as they can carry from the Russian army, which is advancing. They're desperate to surrender to the Americans. And even though the Russians killed 10 times as many Germans as we killed, but we captured, 4 or 5 times as many German prisoners as the Russians did. they were all wanted to surrender to the US or British Army. They didn't want to surrender to the Germans, obviously. And I think that scene really kind of tells you the story of foretells the story of what happens in the Cold War. That there was not an immoral equivalence between these two armies. There was one army that was ended up, attracting the ordinary Germans. This was the battlefield then, wanted to be on the side of one army rather than the other army. And the consequence of that, in the end, was that in order to keep their people inside the Soviet camp, they had to build walls, fences, shoot people who were crossing the Berlin Wall, and so on. But the Berlin Wall, of course, was built much later. But you can see the origins of the Berlin Wall in this scene in Germany in April of 1945. So we won the Cold War not through military conquest. We were, in many respects, weaker than the Soviets were, at least in sort of conventional forces. We won the Cold War because we shifted the battlefield to other areas in which we were strongest. This area of soft power rather than hard power. And, our enemies always learn how to fight asymmetrically. What was Al-Qaeda all about? Of course, you don't fight the US Army on an open battlefield according to, sending out your tanks to fight the American army. You fight in a different way. You fight through urban insurgency, bombs, guerrilla tactics. They learned how to fight asymmetrically. Now, we won the Cold War essentially by fighting the Russians asymmetrically. We didn't fight for the most part, on the military battlefield, because the military battlefield was frozen because once we both had atomic weapons. We fought through soft power, through radios, through there was a very active, I don't want to say propaganda effort, but it amounted to radio stations beaming into the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe. We created an image of ourselves that was preferable, that people wanted to accept. And ordinary Russians wanted to become like Americans and have the same opportunities as Americans. It was amazing to be in Russia at that time because Americans were hugely popular in the Russians, despite, or perhaps because of, the official propaganda. That the more the regime sort of attacked the United States, the more America became popular and as kind of something that people strive towards. Which I think there's another lesson in that too, that we're actually more popular when we don't interfere than when we do interfere. What's the public opinion polls have been conducted in, say, Iraq and Iran? Where is the United States more popular?
Iran.
Obviously Iran, yeah. When the countries that we've intervened in, we end up not being popular at all. The countries that we don't intervene in, we're just a kind of distant dream in their imagination. The United States and America is incredibly popular. I think there's a lesson to be learned from that. There's also the sort of basic sort of nature of the way the Cold War was fought. It was the principle of containment that George Kennan enunciated, which was that there had to be a certain amount of hard power in order to contain the other side. But that allowed you to fight on different battlegrounds, which ended up being more to the advantage of the United States than to our rival in the Cold War. I think this has an application to the way we deal with the threat of Islamic fundamentalism and other kind of nationalisms. That containment was sort of, it came to get a bad word, a bad reputation under the second President Bush. That he enunciated a new policy of prevention, which was still kind of in the aftermath of this shift in American policy from containment to prevention. And this debate is actually going on right now in regards of Iran. But in the case of the Cold War, containment actually worked. And I think it's still, there's still a lot of potential in containment. So finally, I'd say we've proved to be very good at fighting Cold Wars. And we've proven to be not so good at fighting hot wars. Most of the hot wars that we've fought have ended up badly for the United States, particularly recently. And even the one that was we perceive as a great success, i.e. the Second World War, we must never forget that we actually won the Second World War on the backs of a much more ruthless participant, the Soviets. So I think this kind of myth of American military power, I think if you look at the Cold War and the reasons why we won the Cold War, you begin to punctuate it, and you see that our real strengths lie elsewhere. And I didn't want to say that you shouldn't have military power, rely on military power at all, but I think we've got the balance wrong, and we need to readjust the balance. So I think I've come to the end there, but happy to debate or answer questions or whatever.
Good. Thank you, Michael.